So welcome back. This is part 3 of our lecture on studying animal behavior. And so I'm going to move to our PowerPoint. And I think we'll start right here. Well, what techniques do we use when we're studying behavior? There are several different techniques we can do. We can study behavior in the field or in a laboratory setting. So let's think about the field first, and I'll give you an example of some field work that I've been doing. The advantages of studying animals in the field are essentially the field work offers high validity. The behaviors you see out there in the field are real behaviors. They're not a product of being in a laboratory or being in a weird environment. There's a high level of validity. We can study behaviors that are impossible to study in the laboratory. So for example, my sister studies reproductive success in urban versus rural red-shouldered hawks. And these are my kids when they were really little. My triplets each had a baby red-shouldered hawk that they had taken down from a nest. My sister had taken down from a nest to weigh and to get some blood work on. This kind of thing, when you're looking at how urban versus versus rural red-shouldered hawks, how successful they are at reproducing, you can't do this in the lab, right? The disadvantages of doing fieldwork are it's very hard to control or to manipulate or to perform a specific experiment out in the wild. It's time consuming. It's definitely not very efficient to do fieldwork. Let me tell you about some fieldwork that I've been doing in the recent past and get a feeling for what fieldwork can be like, right? So my sister actually and I and a student, Laura, decided to ask the question, do individual black-capped chickadees vary in their winter foraging behaviors? We decided to study black-capped chickadees. They're a small songbird, and you can see the songbird right in the middle of this platform feeder. And we were interested in feeding behavior in the winter, and we asked the question, do individuals vary? So we're interested in kind of looking at whether some individuals are more bold or more shy than others, for example. Are they going to behave differently at the feeders? Here's some background information. Black-capped chickadees are cute little songbirds that are year-round residents in this area of Michigan. They have, as any foraging animal, has to make important decisions. They have to get enough food but avoid being preyed upon. So the presence of a predator can have a dramatic impact on their foraging behavior. We were interested in looking at how the presence of a predator affects foraging behavior at a bird feeder. Okay? And in fact, some researchers have found that the position of the predator, how close it is to the feeder, which way its head is oriented, it's facing, can influence foraging decisions in black-capped chickadees. And we were also interested in we're really interested in asking, do individuals vary in their behavior? Are some animals more bold? Are they more likely to go visit a feeder when there's a predator nearby, for example, than others? Are they going to spend more time? Are they more likely to get a seed than others that are more shy? And so we did some trapping. For the last couple of years, we've been trapping black-capped chickadees in these real fine mist nets that we hang up, and the birds fly into them and get caught. And my sister, and actually my sister's daughter, is in that picture, and I'm working here with a group of animal behavior students who were watching this. And once we've trapped them, my sister has a license for trapping. I don't. You need to band them, and we color banded our chickadees so that each chickadee had a series of 4 different bands to distinguish them in the field. So this individual was white over silver, orange over blue. So white, silver, orange, blue was the name of this particular individual. And we did this with all the chickadees that we collected. We just regular banded other animals in the field. We just gave them a silver band that has a number on that, and you report that number to a governmental agency. that records exactly which animals are banded. And our hypothesis was that the black-capped chickadees would forage to minimize their predation risk. Specifically, if foraging at a feeder, we thought that the black-capped chickadees will visit the feeder more often, maybe spend more time at the feeder, and acquire more seeds when there is no predator versus when there is a predator. So how could we set up our experiment to test this hypothesis? Well, we came up with the idea of presenting a predator to the at the foraging site, and we used a taxidermied Cooper's hawk. And we asked, what kind of behaviors am I going to measure? What am I going to collect? What kind of data am I going to collect? Well, I'm going to measure things like the number of visits each bird makes, the number of seeds they eat, the time that they spend at the feeder, those kinds of things. And I'm also going to have to think a little more about my trials. How are they going to look? Do I need to have a control situation, like just introducing anything on a pole near a feeder? Could that be threatening? So we did set this up so that I had phases in my experiment. We would have kind of a 15-minute pre-trial phase where we simply watched the birds at the feeder. We then presented the animals with a hawk or a songbird. This is a tufted titmouse. It's very small, and that's not threatening at all. It's not a predator of black-capped chickadees. And then we would do a 15-minute trial after the presentation of the stimulus. We'd take a little break, and then we'd do the same thing over again, so that each trial we could compare before the stimulus, during the stimulus presentation, and afterward. And we could compare the hawk to the songbird trials. And then we looked at things like, hey, the number of visits that the animals made during pre-trial phases, songbird phases, post-songbird phases, or predator phases, or post-predator phases. What's interesting thing about this is most of the time they're visiting on average about 20 times, right? About 20 times per 15-minute period, except down here. Look at the predator phase. They're barely ever visiting during the predator phase. Well, that's no surprise. There's a giant predator nearby. We also looked at the mean visit time per phase. How long are they spending? How much time are they spending at the feeder? And these are small amounts of time, 2 to 4 seconds. And again, you can see that when there's a predator around, don't spend much time. If you fly in, grab a seat and fly out fast, right? We're also really interested in individual variation. Like, are some of these birds going to be more bold or more shy than others? Are they going to behave differently at the feeder? And we did a whole bunch of statistical analysis, but I just wanted to show you that birds do vary a lot in the number of visits, for example, that they make to the feeders. Every one of these lines represents a different bird and a different response, essentially. So this blue line, this bird was visiting an awful lot almost all the time. I mean, clearly not when there's a predator, but responds very quick, very differently than another animal. Okay, so there are some bends and twists in here that help us identify some of the bold animals compared to some of the shy animals. And so we can draw the conclusion that, yeah, our data support our hypothesis that individuals vary in their behaviors. We can't use our experimental data to prove our hypotheses to be true, because you simply can't use research to prove the truth of a hypothesis. Instead, we would say, the data support our hypothesis that black-capped chickadees are foraging to minimize their predation risk. They're avoiding the feeder when there's a predator nearby. But does it prove that they're foraging to minimize their predation risk? Well, not necessarily. We're not 100% sure. We just think that the data support it. And similarly, the individual black-capped chickadees are varying in their foraging decisions. It looks like there are different kinds of animals out there, but we can't use a single experiment to prove the truth of a hypothesis. Instead, we would say the data support it. This is just an example of one type of research, a field research event, in which You ask a research question, you address that research question with an experimental design, a good one, you hope, and then you analyze the data and take a look at it. This would have been hard to do in the lab. Now, but the laboratory has its own advantages. Okay, it's very useful to bring animals into the lab, mimic the natural environment so that you can control the environment completely. You can repeat experiments. It's very efficient. You can do the experiment many times with different subjects, for example. Lots and lots of psychological studies on learning, for example, using rats or using mice or using fish can be done in the laboratory in a very controlled way. The disadvantages are you have to always ask the question, does the behavior that you're seeing in the lab have any relationship to what really happens out in the wild, out in the world, right? Or is the behavior just kind of an artifact of your environment that you've created, this artificial environment? When I was studying, doing my graduate work, I did laboratory work looking at how how three-spine stickleback could use cues to predict when a mate was coming or predict when a rival was coming. And this was clearly a learning study, typical of psychological studies, done in the laboratory in a very controlled way. And I found out that, yeah, they could easily use learning. They could easily learn to associate a colored light with the presentation of a rival. A rival's coming when they see the light. They knew it. But does this happen in the wild? I think so. I think they probably use learning in the wild, but we don't know for sure because I didn't do it in the wild, right? So that's one of the big disadvantages. Oh, when you are working on studying the pair bonding in prairie voles with your group, you're going to be doing a little bit of reading and watching a couple of videos and then doing kind of a group response paper. Young and the colleagues that worked on pair bonding in prairie voles work in the lab. It's essentially all lab work, okay, because it has huge advantages. And then sometimes we do comparative studies, and these can involve both fieldwork and lab work, but we compare different genders or people of different cultures, or maybe closely related species, or maybe closely related genera, or we even go farther than that sometimes. These comparative studies can be very useful because when you're comparing different animals or comparing animals in different ecologies, you can start to understand the complexities of behavior and start to understand how very small changes in physiology can have a big impact on behavior. So, for example, when you study prairie voles versus other types of voles, prairie voles are monogamous. Other voles are not. They are polygamous. Why? Well, you start to look at things like the causes of behavior. You look into the brain, what's going on, and you realize that there are small differences that lead to big differences in behavior. Pretty interesting. Okay, so those are some of the kinds of techniques that we use to study behavior, the ways we go about studying it. And you'll read about them, you'll hear about them all the time. Your group assignment that I want you to do is to read and to watch several videos about prairie voles, and then address a small group discussion assignment. And that has a series of questions on it, and to complete that as a group. And that's all I have for this